Basically, I was my career was in brand strategy, working at design and brand firms. Had worked with a lot of really interesting clients, a lot in the financial space, retail banks, a lot, aviation, manufacturing, and during the pandemic, uh, just like had that creative itch, like many others, and had spun up. I'd done a lot of digital art when I was a kid and spent a lot of time on like online forums and gaming forums and stuff. And would do a lot on Photoshop back then and kind of messed around with it in college and did have a design minor, but um, I was doing some like freelance work occasionally if like a friend or a friend of a friend needed like a logo or some brand identity work. But during the pandemic, I just felt like I need to be more creative with that. So kind of got into doing like design everydays and stuff. Was pretty much using mostly Illustrator at the time, and had made a whole website. I started making some merch, and I was just like, "Who's my audience? I don't know where this is going." And like a week after I made my website, a buddy told me about NFTs and just clicked instantly. Dove in, minted some stuff on Rarible. Of course, had to burn it and had typos or whatever, and burning it was $80 and all that stuff. Um, but the general idea made sense that this was just like the blockchain was my online portfolio. It was essentially how I saw it, and started a Twitter and um, ended up spending a lot of time in the Tezos space, sort of like the early Hic et Nunc days, and was there for that whole journey when it shut down and there was a community takeover and all that stuff. But yeah, I spent most of my like first year and a half on Tezos and ended up going back to Ethereum for sort of like manifold type products. I was really interested in doing some more kind of like organized technical stuff with metadata. Got into photography, just being inspired by other photographers. A lot of photography on chain, and during all that, was just sort of very frustrated, both as like a user of these things, like all the different marketplaces and tools, and like couldn't help but put my professional experience and like brand strategy experience glasses on, and was just like I didn't feel like any of these businesses knew what they were doing, and was just like very frustrated because none of it felt really like as creator centric as it was made out to be. Didn't quite feel like the promise of all this amazing stuff that we all like. There's no shortage of supply of creators, right? Like all these creators came online, tried out all these tools. Certainly, the demand for all that, why buy a digital asset, has remained a question, but um, have just sort of been like trying to talk about things both from like my higher level strategy lens and also like nitty gritty user lens. And when Enjoy launched, I thought it was like that was another sort of moment that clicked where it was just like this was a token that was distributed primarily to Zora users, but um, I don't think I had been too active on Zora at the time, so I also got some of the airdrop just from creating and collecting on Ethereum in general. And I was just like, okay, well, this is like a project that's got a very defined audience, sort of like unlike DGen at the time, which was like this is the native currency of Farcaster, and wasn't like leaning as hard into the DGen stuff as it could. It just felt very like unclear who it was for. Whereas it was clear the mission for Enjoy was going to be to build products for that specific audience, which I was part of. And so that was really exciting to me. I was just like, all right, this is where some like aligned incentive structures can be really powerful on chain. And ended up being able to be the director of the project, director of enjoyment. Um,
Oh,
and that's been about 6 months or so. And just have been like very bottled into the Zora ecosystem. So it was like the first ERC20 on Zora chain. Obviously, the whole tipping mechanism we have is specifically for Zora, like protocol. So whether it's Base, Zora chain, whatever, any of the other supported chains, it's a tipping system that works for Zora stuff. It doesn't, it's not on Rodeo or anything else. Um, and I've just felt very like reactive because of that. So a couple things that are happening. One, we're going to move to base network for lots of reasons. We're sort of like the only thing championing the Zora network, and that doesn't feel right anymore. Um, Again, among other reasons, lack of liquidity, et cetera. Um, but also wanting to like get into some first party products that aren't so focused on Zora. So we've got a couple of what we're calling like Zora expansion packs in the works. But after seeing Clanker, it was just like, okay, let's get into the token issuance game. We're a creator coin, a collector coin. Let's actually like enable some of that ourselves and not worry so much about integrating it into tipping. Just do something totally new, uh, sort of go hand in hand with moving to base. And we basically have this problem that like every other token community has, which is whenever somebody makes something Enjoy related, it's awesome. Our community has incredible creators, and um, people just do that because they want to support the community, and they get some distribution through that usually. But um, what we've seen is that like we want to make that permissionless. We want to like the way we think about Enjoy long term is this sort of like creator content network. Um, and so to do that, we wanted to like actually create an incentive mechanism to build or produce content on Enjoy. Um, Clanker came out, and obviously, like Hire has been around for a while. People have been creating content around that. Podcasts, obviously, lots of just static images, posters, design elements, just like brand explorations, all that stuff. But the value capture is not really optimized. Um, Again, you kind of get some distribution just by way of people interested in that content, supporting it and minting it. But we felt like there was a better way to do this where, again, like we have this problem, Hire has this, and then all the new Clanker projects. I think there's been some really interesting projects that have sort of like revealed that like the next step, and maybe this has been obvious the whole time, but the next step once you have a token project is marketing essentially. And how do you onboard contributors essentially? It's really hard to just be a brand account or a couple of accounts or just a solo dev um, producing content to keep attention alive, because we know this is an attention game. And yes, I think lots of us want to build technology around these things, but to do that, you really have to continue to capture attention during that process. And in a week, you can lose attention. So the idea here with Enjoyer was that this would be something that could support any token project that has this problem. Um, the way it works, it's a lot like Clanker. It's not an ERC20 launcher though. You tag Enjoyer and you specify a ticker. So there's going to be a bunch out of the box. We'll continue to add other ones. But just for example, you could tag Enjoyer um, and specify ticker Enjoy, ticker Hire, Anon, whatever. Include an image, PNG, JPEG, or GIF to start, and a name for that. And Enjoyer will deploy a timed open edition to a shared contract for that specific community. So Hire will have anything that specifies Hire will all go in the same place, same with Enjoy and so on. And Enjoyer will reply with a V2 frame that will allow you to mint it. And um, essentially the idea here is the revenue model is such that 50% goes to the creator, 45% goes to buy and burn the specified ticker, and there's a 5% like protocol fee, which will probably burn Enjoy, but because Enjoy is on Zora, it's going to have to be like a manual process for the time being. But that's essentially it. The idea was like, let's do this stuff in feed. This stuff is again like marketing. We think about it like that. The marketing is happening in feed. Having these posts on Zora is not necessarily a huge value add. So do it in the place where people are talking and talking about these tokens. The incentive for people interested in these things is to one, support the content itself just by liking, commenting, recasting, whatever. That helps the community through awareness, but also by minting it, you're directly benefiting the community at large. So rather than doing competitive assets to these tokens, um, which can certainly be a cause for burnout. We wanted to turn these tokens into content networks. So directly support the community by building awareness through great content, minting it to support the creator, and minting it to directly support the token. That's the general idea. I'll pause for a
Yeah,
sec just because I've been talking for like 10 minutes.
yeah, no, it's really interesting. I appreciate the personal backstory and then the context on enjoy and enjoyer. I have some questions about some of the earlier stuff, but just to sort of dive right in, since we're sort of in the weeds on enjoyer from your description. I'm curious, like I'm sort of thinking about this. What's the bet? Like, so basically, I totally understand the value add of it's incentivizing people to create content for these token communities. I agree with all of your sort of assessment on all of that, and that currently, if you go and create, an image for hire or whatever it might be, uh, it's like it would be nice if that directly benefited hire as a community, and the creator, and it sort of just makes more sense, the sort of splits that you've described versus having it be just purely like, created on your own accord, and then maybe you get some distribution from the community boosting it. But ultimately the goal, I think, would be for these, the content that's created to not just benefit from the distribution of the community, but for the content to do well enough to like grow the community basically on its own. And maybe it can do that if there's like sort of these popular pieces of content that do well as like ERC 1155s. And I'm just thinking about sort of like the flow. So I get the general um, sort of formula, and it makes a lot of sense. I'm wondering, sort of picturing someone like, as they do now, put out a piece of content. So let's say someone has a remix on like Gadoopy, and they go and they tag enjoyer and say this is for Gadoopy, and they name the image and they attach the image, and that's like sort of the main cast, and that maybe gets some amount of attention. And then enjoyer responds with this V2 frame, I think you said, which allows for the minting. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. So that the frame, it's great. I mean, it's like it's a mint page. So it's
Right.
got information on who created it, what token cult it's for, how many mints there are, how much of the token has been burned. Um, all those burns happen like in the transaction. So if I mint 10, for example, then that buy and burn is going to happen along with that transaction. So that'll be like dynamic counter. Uh, so as it's happening, you can see how much time is remaining and how much has been burned. Uh,
So one thing that I'm wondering basically is, with so like that's one way to do it, right? You tag, and people are familiar with that, where you tag enjoyer just like you would tag Clanker, and does the response. And I guess with Clanker, it happens where the token is launched. There's a bunch of like bots and snipers. Obviously, they're sort of like
mhm,
working on that. But the ones that become popular, I feel like it's, in some sense, it's from the original cast, but it's also mostly from like post cast, I feel like, where
mhm.
people are, like, first of all, maybe the price sort of gets some attention. If the price is going up an abnormal amount, then it's like, oh, this one's kind of interesting. More people are casting about it, whatever. And then the original cast is mostly useful just for the fact that it's like, oh, who casted this in the first place? Because that kind of matters. Like, are they like a legit person, or like a scammer or something? Or are they going to rug it, whatever? For this, I feel like there might not be as much sort of like, because it's already sort of like derivative from the ERC20. Um,
Mhm.
there might not be as much sort of like secondary, not secondary in the sense of like OpenSea, but like secondary in the sense of like after the original cast, there's going to be a bunch of other casts that sort of like link back to it, because it itself is like a link to the token that's representing. And so basically what I'm wondering is like, does that reply model, is that the best sort of like form factor here? Or basically like the first thing that kind of stood out to me is like, I think cast actions have been pretty underutilized. I mean, you could argue that they're just not that useful, and maybe that's true. But compared to frames, which like everyone knows frames, everyone engages with frames. Obviously, V2 frames are newer, and so less people have made them and engaged with them. But like, theoretically, those are like a lesser transition from frames to V2 frames that you could see them catching on, and they're really cool. I like them. I don't know if frames V2 is the right name for them. I think they were like, I actually don't know the difference between mini apps and V2 frames, but they seem
Hmm.
pretty similar, if not the same. And I kind of like the word mini app, but regardless, that transition is like sort of easier to foresee. You click a button and you get this thing in your feed, just like sort of the frames were, except these are, more functional. You can do a lot more than you could in the previous frames, which were popular enough in their own right, arguably like the most popular thing to be, made on Farcaster to date in terms of like functionality. And so basically what I'm wondering here is like, could it make sense, even though, it's always hard to bet on like a form factor that hasn't yet succeeded yet, but like in some sense, Clanker did that. I mean, I guess there were other things where you could tag the bot and it would do things, but Clanker did it in a way that obviously has really worked. And I wonder with Enjoyer if another sort of implementation of it, I'm not saying like instead of the one that you've said, but it would be like probably in addition to, would be like sort of a cast action where, um, or even you can imagine it as like a client, but that's like pretty heavyweight
Hmm.
built. But more simply like sort of a cast action where someone goes to cast, like clicks the action button or whatever, and then rather than tagging it and having the mint show up sort of like automatically by the bot in the reply, it would be like the main cast sharing the piece of art would be the mint already. You know what I mean? I wonder if that could be sort of like an
Oh
interesting
yeah.
second path to how these enjoyments like sort of show up on the feed, how people sort of like make them happen. So you would still have the reply functionality, I think. Like I wouldn't, that sounds good. Like it's a good way to introduce it, I think for sure. But I wonder if having it as the main cast, so rather than sharing just an image with the information and the tag, it's like already built in, and people are just sharing these, enjoyer posts or mints or whatever you want to call them, as like the main post that's getting the main activity and main engagement, like in the feed. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of ways we can iterate on it, and that's a great idea. I think like you could, so first of all, you can share these links also out of the box. So the frame will include a share link. So if I created something and I want to cast about it again, I could just cast the frame.
Got it.
Having a composer would be great. Um, I think because it's a mini app, right now it's just the Mint page, but you could see maybe there's a page for hire or whatever, and that's sort of like a gallery of all the things that are live or completed in secondary. Um, I think I'm looking at like Anon as a really great, I guess, client type thing for this as well, where like Anon is so great because the technology itself just enables co-op mode for what is already a co-op mode concept. Um, where like it's just aggregating all the content through there, both in how it's displayed and how it's created. So there's some stuff there, yeah, where like maybe there's a way to create it where you don't have to do it in the feed. It just felt like that was a good starting point. Um,
Yeah, I think starting with the familiar sort of path definitely makes sense, for what people are sort of used to doing. Like you don't have to teach them something new, like teaching people, like having people like what you're offering and trying to teach them sort of a new thing with cast actions, which like most people aren't currently using, I would say, is like making it maybe harder than it needs to be. It just seems like an interesting, like if it wasn't that the Clanker sort of tag a bot was more familiar to people, I feel like having it be the main cast as the mint would be better for a few reasons. But given the familiarity, I think that's a definitely a sensible place to start. Um,
yeah, I
Rewinding a
mean,
little bit. Yeah, go ahead.
the last thing I'll say about it is just like what we want to enable here is just like, and this is obvious through larger token communities like the ones we've been talking about. But the general principle is just that for a creator, it's much easier to get distribution, grow, gain reputation in the context of a community. And so this is really like a co-op, a collab tool to let people permissionlessly collab together. For example, I could make like an art token, and then a bunch of artists can contribute media to that art token uh, using this tool. It's very simple. It's very flexible, which is good. But there are definitely ways we could um, build upon it later to where like maybe there's a podcast contract, maybe there's uh, a an artist guild that has multiple projects. There's a lot of ways we can kind of drill down and make it more customizable, focused later on. But just starting sort of as big as possible with as low friction as possible, um, felt like it would be the best way to get a sandbox going around this.
Yeah, I mean, you could even have like obviously you're starting with images and GIFs, but video is obviously like sort of the next thing that kind of obviously comes to mind. You mentioned podcasts, like less obvious, but also would be interesting. Like I know Chick Bangs has Hire.fm.
Mm-hmm.
It would be pretty cool if the mints from that were, had like sort of the same fee model that Enjoyer is enabling. And then the other one that's kind of could be interesting, it's like almost like a next version on the tipping mechanism in a sense, would be like sort of the degen version of tipping, would be if actually
We're
just
we're
like
thinking about that.
like every cast basically.
Yeah, so we haven't done tipping in feed because we really liked that on Zora it's tied to a transaction. So we felt like, yeah, there's farmers, of course, but like it's generally like high signal. And if we enabled tipping just on content created with Enjoyer, that would be really great because, if you comment on Zora, that doesn't like actually do too much for distribution, but in feed, comments are huge. So enabling tipping in the feed where people are more likely to leave comments um, is just another way to add signal to this and help like discover what's trending. Um, there's some other integrations we could do in feed as well. Um, to do this. Like this works really nicely with like Bounty Bot or Rounds or even something like Banker could be a really cool integration where just like fully going into the fact that these things they exist to promote the community more than anything. Um, Obviously, something like a podcast, stands alone on its own right to some degree, um, but that's kind of like a later on problem.
Yeah, I think the thing that I'm sort of wondering and thinking about is like as someone who has, I mean, this doesn't really apply as directly for base colors, like the main thing my main
Mm-hmm.
project I'm working on, because it's an NFT collection and it's a little different for a lot of reasons than an ERC20. But I'm also, experimenting with like the clankers. I did Helvetica and regardless of whether it's NFT, ERC20, whatever, any community that you're trying to build around any token, whether it's fungible or non-fungible, you want just, a high volume of high quality um, content. And I think ideally for me and for a lot of these communities, you want it in your channel on Farcaster. And that content includes, images and GIFs and uh, and videos and podcasts and all of that. But it's also just, just a plain text cast is also like great, especially if it's like quality stuff. And so it's like, maybe that sort of fits in, whether it's through tipping or maybe the cast turns into a ERC 1155 piece of art sort of thing. I don't really know the exact implementation, but anything like basically the problem that you guys are trying to solve with Enjoyer of making the fees so that they incentivize the content creation more so and benefit the community as well as the creator, that I think can be extended, whatever the mechanism may be, also to just like plain vanilla text only casts, because I would love to, like, I'm all for images and things, and whether it's Helvetica channel or base colors or whatever, but I also would just love plain text, thoughtful casting. And so what's the equivalent basically of Enjoyer in the V1 implementation that can do the same thing to encourage just straight casting? I sort of wonder, what that could look like. But
Yeah. I
you
mean, just
know,
to
I
respond to
go.
that real quick, I do think I would love to see people use this for like screenshot essays. I think that would be a fun thing. There's like certain projects that this is not tokenized, but First Draft Club, where there's a lot of like written content around that. It does feel like an interesting use case for what I've never made a screenshot essay, but people love doing it, and they tend to do like pretty well. So that's people have certainly done that with Hire and other communities. So I'd love to see that as one way people use it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a big screenshot essay guy myself, and so that definitely is interesting to me. One more sort of just kind of like logistical question. I'm not sure, I might have missed this, but for the V1, you mentioned like sort of the content will aggregate to
Mhm.
like whatever the community is. Just using Hire to continue for an example. Is there going to be an easy way for people to like obviously you go to the Hire channel, you can see all the Hire content, but is there going to be an easy place or way to see all of the Hire content only that's posted with Enjoyer in like a feed somewhere, or it's mostly going to be like sort of behind the scenes at the contract level, and then like later if people wanted to build like sort of feeds for this stuff, they could do that?
Yeah, I think that's the case. I mean, out of the box, like just like what I think has been really great about all the ERC20 stuff is the tool is Uniswap. So we kind of tried to just not over engineer this and be like, all right, OpenSea is like if there's secondary on something, or you want to view the whole contract with all the media on it, you can go to OpenSea. And um, the way we're doing it is there's metadata tags for the creator, and the descriptions will include the creator name as well. That'll be the F name. So like there will be like a gallery of all this content on OpenSea. We could obviously create some UI around that and sort it by number of mints or trending or live or secondary or whatever. But just out of the box, having like OpenSea be the place where if you want to dig deeper, um, every one of the frames will have that OpenSea link as well.
Nice. Yeah, that makes sense. As long as there's some place to see that, I think that's a pretty nice little value add to be able to just scroll all the content for a community with a filter basically on like enjoyer content, which I would think will be like sort of distinct from just going through a channel, be more, image focused and just sort of like an interesting feed to be able to scroll, even if it's just on OpenSea to start.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, go
like this is a simple way of thinking about it, and again, there's ways to add complexity, but the way we're thinking about it is it's a media page for your token. We've seen like different token communities on their website have like a media page, and I've seen everything from like I don't even remember the name of like this third party meme site to Google Drive to a Zora page. Um, that was the idea here, was like this can be your media page, and if there's some like more custom interface that we build for that later, then it could be even more elegant.
So, you mentioned Hire, which I think is sort of an obvious example to me. I feel like that's probably the highest volume and quality combination of content for any token community on Farcaster, or at least one of them. Are there other communities, like as you're mentioning, like sort of looking at these media pages on various websites? Are there other token communities that sort of stand out to you as having done something kind of interesting, or maybe they're sort of like punching above their weight class for the content that's coming out of the communities versus like the market cap of the coin or things like that? Basically, just like in sort of looking into this, communities that have stood out to you, or we sort of named the top few, just in
No,
like
I've
sort of citing examples.
no, I think there's some really interesting use cases where so like the Foncoin, so Helvetica comes and stand out. I've seen really interesting community kind of contests and content produced around those. Jadupi is a great example. Obviously, a lot of that's coming from the creator, but also the community has come around and created stuff around that too. So what doesn't matter who you are, you can both come together and collab through this. Anti memes meme club is another cool one. That's like another. I think these are like very media centric projects in general, so they lend themselves to this, which is really cool. There's Touch Grass by Eric's. was this experiment where he created a token called Touch Grass, and he created a Coinbase wallet um, gallery where people could permissionlessly add to the gallery, and he's got this like rewards mechanism for rewarding people who contribute to that gallery. Um, those have been really cool. So I think this kind of like art project or media project idea lends itself really nicely to it. Um, Anon is a really interesting one because people have created content both like as their identity, but also through the Anon account. So the Anon account is an interesting example that like I want to test minting some stuff with Enjoyer through. Because that's like the most co-op of all these things. So those are some of the names I'm thinking about that we'll definitely include at launch as supported tokens, um, just because of the quality of content that's surfaced around them.
Yeah, those are most of the ones that come to mind for me as well. And I'm sure we'll have, a lot more to come. But beyond that, sort of rewinding, I'm just kind of curious, the origin story of like your connection with Enjoy. It's kind of interesting. You mentioned sort of like seeing it come about and then, joining as like the director of Enjoyment, which is an awesome title, by the way. But like were you not involved with the initial launch at all? And then you were able, like, I'm curious, like, sort of how you went from, it sounds like seeing this thing that you had nothing to do with come about, and then, ultimately joining and being, one of the leads on the project.
Yeah, no, I was very much just like a user, an interested user. Again, sort of seeing the potential in it as being a community focused project, which like you would think that just throwing a name out there, and I'm not actually specifically critiquing anything, but Super Rare, for example, right? Like that should be a community focused project, right? Like constantly supporting its users in whatever way. I felt like because the token Enjoy was like had that very clear relationship of who it was building for. Again, included myself. So I was not part of the team at launch. I just saw it and sort of was talking about Zora, Super Rare, all these things on the feed, and Enjoy became a part of what I was talking about there. Um, there's a lot of like things that we hope to be the case. Like the vision for Enjoy is like cross-platform, cross-chain creator network, um, and Enjoy sort of being like this base currency for all that. I think the idea that the protocol fee for Enjoyer is ultimately helping the Enjoy token is an interesting concept. I don't. It's not necessarily like going to be the main thing that we're talking about, but um, that is a great way to drive value back to Enjoy. And again, um, like really, if this product does well, then Enjoy tips will be worth more, which is benefiting creators in a different part of the ecosystem. So that kind of like relationship across products is very interesting. We want to dive into that. Um, Again, we sort of like as an artist, like as an individual artist, the idea, the hope is one day that my own work, my work uh, stands on its own, and I can sort of be evaluated for that. Um, but like in the context of a community, it's much easier to get people interested in what I'm creating. So kind of creating these larger community tools that we think can scale down into helping the individual creators with their own work. Um, is sort of like the progression we see here. Um,
Yeah. So,
yeah, hope that makes sense.
it does. And I do think, obviously, if Enjoyer kind of clicks and works out, it's clearly would be a great benefit to Enjoy, which I should mention, I guess. Trying to remember, I feel like I got some initial airdrop when Enjoy launched, and I was pretty interested because I really like Zora, and this was the first. It was, at the time, DGen was quite new, I think, and I just sort of got my head around DGen tipping, and that was really cool. And then Enjoy. This was, I think, even maybe before. Maybe there were some other tipping things on Farcaster, but Enjoy was basically saying we're going to do tipping on Zora, and just as I think, like if Farcaster is to Twitter as Zora is to Instagram, you could argue then it makes sense if something is working on the Twitter equivalent, it might work on the Instagram equivalent as well. And so I was sort of interested, and I got the airdrop, and I think I still hold some, and should probably just mention that. But I've also like always enjoyed the content from day one of Enjoy. They were pretty prolific, I feel like, from day one on having like a ton of memes and stuff. And obviously, that's the whole sort of thesis behind Enjoyer here, is that that's the sort of stuff that ideally you build great product and things as well, cool tools and whatnot. But just the content like goes so far and is so important. And if you have the product without the content, you probably don't have anything. And if you have the content without the product, you could probably get by for a while until you have the product. So I've Enjoy's been on my radar for a while. But more sort of personally speaking, I'm curious like what kind of art you're into, what you like to create. As I mentioned before we started the recording, like what caught my eye originally from your profile was on Zora. A bunch of photography that you've done where I just sort of like I guess in my head like sort of bookmarked you as like this guy who's on Zora who basically has like my favorite photographs, because a lot of Zora there is a good amount of photography, but a lot of it is sort of just like people creating various graphics and whatnot, and there's not like a ton of just like pure photography relative to that, I feel like, and or AI stuff and
Yeah.
whatever. And so your just like natural photographs from like a lot of like Northeast type stuff was just like I just loved the vibe of all of that. So is that you mentioned like sort of picking up photography, I think relatively recently. Is that sort of your favorite thing to do these days, or do you prefer to actually like be in Figma or Photoshop or using AI or whatever? Like what are your favorite sort of mediums to and like sort of things to create these days?
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Yeah, photography has been sort of this thing that's like, I guess I just think of all these digital art skills as like part of a toolbox. Um, so like I have been experimenting more with film. I want to do a lot more with film. Obviously, time is like a big thing here. And it's been interesting. Like I was a big one of one maxi like in the first few years, even when I was on Tezos. Um, and like my first big project, which unfortunately I didn't finish, was called Urban Mythology V2. I'm from New York City. I live in New York City now. And it was this big, like, one of one project that has 500 one of ones right now. It was supposed to have like 1,000. It was supposed to be New York City through the seasons. So I
Mm.
finished summer, I finished fall. I have all the photography done for winter and spring, but I didn't get to editing them and publishing them. I was doing it on mainnet, so that was also like expensive. Doing all the metadata was really time consuming. There's literally like 15 tags for everything from like files type to uh, portrait, landscape to like borough, neighborhood, tags for like retail or corporate, like all this stuff. Um,
Can you do that on like base now, or like you go to were you doing this
I
on chain where you got to a certain point on ETH mainnet and then like you would have to continue that way, or can you just do it on, could you finish it on base?
I'd have to finish that project on mainnet. I was using Manifold because it was the best tool for using metadata. It was still a very manual process. I can't tell you how many hours like I put into that. Um, but I guess the point of that story was just like I never bought into this like artificial scarcity mindset. I felt like this was going to be my portfolio. If I'm like happy with the work, I'm going to publish it. And like Zora has changed a lot of my philosophy around that, where not really actually not changed my philosophy. Sort of like leaned into that philosophy of like I'm just going to publish work that I'm happy with, and over time that will tell a larger story. Um, and so the project that you sort of mentioned on Zora is this project from Nantucket, which is also kind of through the seasons. I used to do a lot more like photo manipulation and compositing and stuff like that. I definitely want to get back to that. Experimented with some 3D. I've experimented with AI. I've got like 5 projects like in my backlog that I want to do. but right now I do really want to finish that Nantucket project on Zora. Um, Not totally sure what's next, but the general, I guess, like aesthetic here is my dad is an architect. Most of my work doesn't include humans. If they do, they're really not the subject. So I'm very obsessed with environments. I always felt like an environment can tell stories about people even without people in them. So whether it's 3D or AI, like that's sort of the core. I do want to get out of my comfort zone and include people in that more, but that is how I sort of look at the world, is through environments. And obviously there's a lot of really interesting meta subject material there as it pertains to like the online world and the metaverse and all that stuff that I want to kind of dig into more. I think personally the photography, um, I feel like after this Nantucket project, I'll be at this point where it'll be less about just like the real world and digging more into the getting even more creative with what that looks like in my imagination versus just the photographs I'm taking. Um, super nostalgic, super lo-fi, into all that stuff, and want to just like explore that deeper. But um, yeah, also want to help other creators make money. It's just been like such an underserved user base that I feel like, again, just like some of these tokens that we've been talking about, I think are like net new types of projects. Just using Helvetica as an example, like this is a collaborative project. You can think of it like an art or a design project. Um, and that's enabling and revealing new types of creativity that I think is going to change how people view creators and view content that's on the network. Like the definition of creator personally has been very kind of like uh, artist focused, but like if you create a token, you're a creator on chain. If you buy a token, you're a curator. Um, so like viewing and joy through that lens of like, let's just elevate and fix the value chains for people who are creating tokens and collecting tokens, um, is a really interesting framing for all this stuff.
Do you have a third place, like in addition? It's interesting, like these, I feel like there's a lot of parallels between the New York project, which can I see, like I know you said you didn't finish it, but the parts that you have done are up on
Oh
Manifold.
yeah.
Yes, I'd like to check that out. It sounds super cool. And then the Nantucket one I've enjoyed. Um, so I'm curious what goes into finishing the Nantucket one, like finishing in air quotes, I guess, because it seems like it's kind of up to you when to call it like complete. But I'm curious, like what goes into finishing that, and then like if there's a third place. Like I love what you said about sort of like environments, telling stories, and you obviously seem to be very into that versus like just leaning into what you like there versus forcing yourself to like take pictures of people because that's what other people are doing or something. So like I like that sort of theme that you've built. Are there other places you've had in mind, or New York and Nantucket are sort of like the main two, and you wouldn't be really sure what like a third one would be?
Yeah, New York is interesting because it's, again, I've already got so much work on it, and I'm sure I'll continue to produce work around New York as long as I'm here. Nantucket, I had spent a lot of time there for a few years during the pandemic, um, but I'd like to travel more. And I think, I don't know, personally, I really enjoy my own, I guess, travel photography because, first of all, I'm not often like as a photographer, it's always exciting to explore a new place. So even in the city, I try to go to neighborhoods I haven't been to, or go during a different time of day or whatever, so that I do have kind of fresh eyes when I'm going to those places. So anytime I travel, it's like totally overstimulating. And I think there's a lot of like the aesthetic that carries. Again, like I've got design background, very into architecture. Like I look a lot at lines and composition. Um, so when I go into nature, it's really fun to apply that because sometimes it's hard. There's a lot more curves, and it's really fun to do that. And I think like again, going into AI or 3D where I can kind of create those environments, um, starts to get interesting. So as far as the third place, no, I would like to travel more. And then I think the third place is actually what I call my imagination. I've got this kind of like two projects that are kind of overlapping. I'm not exactly sure how I'll execute, but the idea was to create like a dream or video game world. Obsessed with gaming when I was not so much these days, but as a kid, I'm an only child, so I spent a lot of time playing video games, and I love the idea of creating uh, just new worlds. So I guess that third place would be something new that doesn't exist yet.
That's a good answer. What about with the video game worlds? Are there any that stick out from childhood or otherwise that were like your favorite or most interesting worlds?
Oh, geez. Wow. I feel like there's probably a super long list I could, if I really thought about it. Legend of Zelda comes to mind, Shadow of Colossus, uh, some of the sci-fi stuff like Dead Space. Oh, geez.
Would
Any of the
yours
Final
would yours
Fantasy
do you think
games.
have like themes from these? Like would it be similar or like something totally different?
So I've done some experiments with the video game idea, and there have been kind of both. There's been the more like, I guess I would categorize it as like fantasy and sci-fi. Um, the sci-fi is a little easier because there are more like man-made elements, right? So I can kind of think about what a man-made environment looks like in a futuristic sense versus like a more defined world. I think like I'd love to create like a video game map or something. uh, I'm really obsessed with parks. I've had this idea for creating like a virtual reality park before. I spend tons of time in New York City and have like done research into how they created it and how every time you turn down a different path, they like really designed it with like a specific vista in mind.
Hmm.
So thinking about like what does that photograph look like when I'm coming down a path here? How does that play with the opposite angle or whatever? Like those are things I'm really interested in exploring. Haven't done as much as I'd like to, but um, with video games, the sort of the projects I've done have been centered around the idea of like loading or new game, where when you like turn the game on for the first time, there's always this like splash screen that has this like vista where you hit new game, and that's a very like ceremonious moment to clicking that. Or if you're on like a continue screen, yes or no, or a loading screen where there's like these in between moments. I think the word that I sort of left out here is liminal. Um, Super obsessed with liminal and this idea of in between. That's often why I don't use people. And if I do, they are part of like the in between transitioning uh, phase of things. So I love thinking about that, about like, what does that one moment feel like? It's very meditative, very like, uh, trying to capture like a very specific feeling, I think.
What's interesting about, I mean, this is like a very big question, but I don't, maybe you have an answer or a response of some kind. Like, what's interesting about liminal? Because that seems like, or this in between time, it seems like an extremely niche, like sort of thing to pay attention to and be interested in. Do you have any sense of why that's interesting to you, or what about it?
Oh man, it is niche, but there is a lot of content around it. Like there's tons of Twitter accounts, even like automated ones that share liminal spaces. You can think about a lot about like nostalgic Americana, like 90s, 80s, like empty blockbusters or empty malls or theme parks or these things. Um, I think nostalgia is probably like the thing there, and I always like to describe nostalgia as like a very powerful drug that is like any other drug has to be like balanced. Like becoming too nostalgic is very dangerous, because I don't want my art to be something that just like is an escape from reality. I kind of want to bounce you back to like feel something, but also remind you of where you are.
Hmm.
That's why the New York stuff is very interesting to me, because it's like millions of people have walked down this one street or whatever, and you can kind of get that sense of it, decay on the buildings or whatever. Um, Feeling like this is a place that you can walk in right now, but also it's been here for decades, and people have had their own memories and experiences there. Um, Liminal. I started an artist guild called Metaliminal, um, We actually just made a project for hire. I can shoot you a link for that. Um, and yeah, photographers in particular, I think, are drawn to this idea. They love capturing those moments of in between, um, because they're really powerful for evoking specific emotions. It's like a concentrated dose of whatever emotion it is. You can feel like pure joy or extreme sadness, whereas a complex scene might not do that necessarily. And it really forces you to be in tune when you're obviously shooting something as a photographer. You could be designing in 3D or whatever, but it forces you to hone in on that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I just I've never heard this sort of angle on photography or art or anything really in general. And it sounds like there are other people sort of interested in this thing, but I've never talked to them. So it's cool to hear that perspective. And it might explain part of why, like, your Nantucket work has stood out to me from the Zora feed. Like, I see it got to the point where I would see, I mean, on the one hand, it is specific to a place, so that's like a signal slash identifier. But I would see like one of your photos in the feed, and like the user, like the creator, is kind of not the most in your face piece of a
Mm-hmm.
post on Zora, so you can like sort of see the art before you know who did it. And I would like see various photos from you, and in my head, no, like I would know, like the instant before I would actually look who posted it, I would already know that it was yours. And again, part of that might have been because it was similar place, but I think you posted stuff from like not from Nantucket as well. And I remember being surprised that I was able to guess that it was yours before seeing that it was yours. And it's not like I follow like 10 people. Like I don't follow like a ton of people, but I follow probably like, I don't know, I could be wrong, but I feel like I might follow like 100 people or something. And then also you're constantly seeing stuff in your feed from people you don't follow just because people you follow minted it or whatever. So it's like not, a super high probability that a given post is going to be yours. And yet somehow I was able to sort of like identify it. And I feel like it's partly because of the place, but also probably because of this very distinct, like sort of through line on a lot of your work. So I know we're coming up on time, but one more question that might be also sort of a difficult one to answer, but sort of stood out to me as you're talking about like sort of doing some pretty intentional research on New York and how it was built, specifically parks, I think, but maybe just more generally. And I just kind of want to like double click on that. Like what's interesting that most people don't know. I mean, you mentioned the one thing that like certain things were designed where what's the vista that you see when you turn around this corner or whatever. But are there other sort of interesting things about the way that New York or parks specifically in New York have been built that just are interesting that most people don't know about or don't think about?
Perhaps a sideways way of answering your question. I think like I always encourage people to like look up or look around them, um, at their environments. And New York is so interesting because it does have this history. Different parts of the country and world have similarities and differences, but it's fascinating because it's like I almost have this forced appreciation for New York because I've like been here so long and experienced this like getting used to it phase, and then I had to like very intentionally be like, this place is amazing. Like,
Hmm.
it's not that I'm bored of it or anything, but a little bit of intentional reminders to like actually look and pay attention because there's so much there. And I think a lot of people don't. I don't know if appreciate's the right word, but these environments have such an impact on our lives. And in New York, which is such a dense area, it's especially true. Like when you go to Central Park on a sunny day, there's the Great Lawn or whatever is like almost completely packed with people sunbathing because it's like this haven in this otherwise like city that is totally chaotic, and the environment compounds that so like so many times over. You go into a subway or whatever and think about like uh, infrastructure and architecture as these things that like actually have a huge impact on our emotions and how we live our lives. Uh, a lot of people aren't necessarily so aware of it. So that's just like one thing I hope to achieve through my art is to just like get people to look at that and care about it, because you look at a lot of stuff that's like new, and if it's made by the government or whatever, it's like there's not a lot of care and love put into it. You could use an example of like, I think about the New York subway system or like a DMV or something. It's like these are like kind of depressing places, um, and are like maybe subconsciously making people depressed by being in them. Um, if everybody kind of had this appreciation, um, that's how you make a city or a place lively and beautiful. And of course, that's not the case with everything. There's tons of beautiful, amazing stuff in New York in particular, but um, I do think it's important to just notice those things and have an awareness of those things as you're moving through them, um, because they matter and we should care about them, and we should want our places to make us feel cared for. Right? If they're built by somebody, then there is a very direct like, do I care about the people using this stuff? And something like the park is the most beautiful example about that, where it was, despite how it's not very large, um, but it was very intentionally designed to be this oasis in a place that's otherwise quite crazy.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I can somewhat appreciate or resonate with what you're saying in that I feel that being a photographer or just having photography as a hobby naturally increases this awareness and appreciation that you're talking about. Like even I'm not that. Don't really take a ton of photos. I'm not a photographer or anything, but even just I started taking a bit more for when I was leaning in a little bit more on Zora, and like when they launched the app, just using it more and posting whatever I wanted, photos mostly. And I noticed like having this, it's just like how when you have like a tweeting habit,
Mm-hmm.
that you sort of find yourself thinking in tweets sometimes, where otherwise like you probably wouldn't think of like these like 2 sentence things. You might think like, I know when I was blogging a lot, I wasn't thinking in tweets, I was thinking in ideas of things to write more long form about. And so like that was the type of thing like where I would stumble upon some situation or have some thought, and suddenly, because I'm in the habit of writing blog posts, it gets bookmarked as like, oh, that's an interesting thing, I should write about that. And then I'll like sort of take a note. But if you're not writing blogs and you're tweeting, it's sort of like, instead of having the idea of something longer to write about or an idea to explore, it's more of like, oh, what's the 1 or 2 liner on that? And like it becomes a tweet. And so you sort of like end up thinking in whatever it is that you're used to your output, like sort of lane or output sort of like form factor being. And when the output or one of your output form factors is photography, I feel like you have this sort of like mental groove of like constantly looking for angles on things and like ways to look at things that they look nice. And as a result of that, like and that's like a very simplistic version, that's my version, yours is a lot more nuanced and everything. But regardless, like you're sort of paying more attention and just like sort of being more aware on visuals, whereas tweeting or writing might be more related to like ideas than visuals. And I found that to be like probably the most beneficial or enjoyable part of developing a little bit of a photography habit, was just being more aware of my surroundings, basically. Whereas writing and tweeting increases awareness of ideas. It's nice to have both of those. So one more question, and then I'll let you go. But given your appreciation for your environment and like sort of hypersensitivity, I would say to not that that's like a good or a bad thing. I just think you're probably more aware of these environments given your interest
It's
with
accurate.
environments. Yeah. So given that sort of sensitivity, I'm curious how you think about where you spend the majority of your time, regardless of travel or anything. Like you're living in New York. You mentioned you spent a few years primarily in Nantucket, super different environments. I'm curious how you think about like whether it's for now or for the long run. You also mentioned seasons, like with both your projects having an impact, and I've become somewhat obsessed with this concept of seasonal living. where I think it would
Mm,
be, I think living in one place year round, um, before there was a practical necessity for it, that you had to be in a particular place for your job. And now for anyone who works remotely, I think people who were like in finance in New York who went remote realized like, hey, I don't have to live in New York. I can go live in, Denver or whatever, or, Carolinas or something. Or if you're working in big tech, like you don't have to live in San Francisco anymore. You can go work in, you know, elsewhere in Northern California or Nevada or whatever you want. So people sort of have already, appreciated this. Like, I don't have to live in that one specific place where I found my job anymore. But less so have people, I think, started to lean in on like, I don't actually have to live in one place at all. Like, I could have, potentially with that, like, obviously there's like, snowbirds and people who live in the Northeast most of the year, but then live in like Florida for 3 months in the winter or something. But I'm talking about something like more, I think it's possible to do it in a more accessible way that doesn't, you don't have to own multiple houses, but, as the simplest example, you could live in, I'm currently in Miami. I could live here for, 9 months of the year, sublet my place out from June through August and go live somewhere else, primarily like one other place, maybe in the Northeast or something, in the winter. And that's sort of like my MVP for it. And I actually sort of organized that for this past summer. I didn't end up doing it for a number of reasons, but I sort of proved myself that it could be done. Like I found a subletter and everything. And I think that's really interesting. But whether it's, one place or a seasonal living sort of cycle or anything like that, I'm curious how you think about, where you think you would like to, like if you're, New York for life, or if you think about other places that you might like to live, and just how you think about, even thinking about like where to live.
that is a fun question. I don't know that I have a great answer. I'm again an only child. My folks are here. They're on the older side, so I'll be here for the foreseeable future. I think places I've always I don't know that I'll ever live on the West Coast, but I love the West Coast. I love Colorado. That's a place that I think is exciting all year round. New York, as I'm starting to experience again right now, is not the best place in the winter. It's dark all the
Uh,
time and cold, and we didn't even have snow last year, so it's like the one saving grace is when it's a little magical. Having my memories of being a child here, it was very much a like beautiful white Christmas winter. Uh, Now it's just cold and dark, so I would love to escape that at some point. But yeah, I don't know. I'm friends. Crypto's been really interesting. I meet a lot of people who are like van lifers or nomads, and I don't know that that'll ever be my comfort zone. But um, there is this weird idea that I am at least partially living on the internet also, and that like really comes into play with where you actually live physically. Um, So it's something I think probably anybody in crypto has probably thought a lot more about, certainly if they're working remote. Um, but yeah,
yeah, no,
I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
yeah, I'm the same way where I feel like more and more I am living on the internet. And even if it's not necessarily like the internet, like I like having a nice long phone call with like, my parents or friends who don't live near me, which is most of my good friends at this point. And like I don't mind that sort of like, having a lot of my social interaction be either on the internet or on phone calls or whatever. And at least I end up traveling, quite a lot, where even if I'm only going somewhere, once a month or something that I'm seeing friends, it's like that's sort of like I kind of get my, scratch my itch on some of the more social stuff. And I see enough people in person down here or whatever, but it's just sort of like an interesting mix when your work and a lot of your social is, on the internet or whatever you want to call it. It doesn't depend on sort of your physical surroundings. I think it opens up possibilities for what you choose to be your physical surroundings to be, a lot wider of a range of possibilities than they otherwise might be if you're prioritizing being very close to a lot of your friends or being very close to a specific, industry where they're, hiring for whatever work it is you want to do or whatever like that. When you remove all of those constraints, just like what do I want my natural environment to be? And for me, I think I've sort of come to the answer that it's like, it's not New York or some like really like rural place or something, but it's New York. And like I love like sort of the
Mm.
busyness and the energy of New York, and it's like sort of intoxicating and contagious, and I think mostly positive way. But maybe if it's all the time, for me personally, it can be maybe start to be a little bit like not as positive. And then you go to a rural place and you get like that reset and that slowness. And for me, I think similar to how you described with your photography, there's like a very timing plays like a huge role, not just the seasons, but even like on more of a micro scale, like the timing of certain situations. And for me, it would be sort of like given that I can include timing as an element in where I live, I feel that it is good to, and I would like to. And maybe it's just me obsessing with this thing that like I should just like sort of pick a place and be fine there. But I feel like if you're going to spend a lot of time thinking about something and iterating on something over the course of a lifetime, where you live is as well worth doing that for as anything else. So anyway, been an awesome conversation. Excited to go check out some of these projects that you've talked about, and obviously play with Enjoyer when it's out. When is Enjoyer like live, or is it live already?
Should be live tomorrow. We're
Live tomorrow.
testing today. Yeah.
Cool. Well, we're recording this as of December 16th. We will get the podcast out in due course, and Enjoyer out December 17th. Go create some content for your favorite community, and yeah, enjoy.
Exactly. Appreciate you, Jake.
Awesome. Thanks, man.